Civil unrest, riots, stabbings, young men with machetes, useless police, arrests, and so forth. That's what we've seen over the past couple of weeks. A sudden dramatic explosion after the Labour government swooped in and took over from the almost as awful Conservative Party. So in Leeds, we start off with seeing buses burnt, huge civil unrest, and a police force that can't even tackle basic riots. These riots used to be triggered by really big stories, really big things were happening to cause such explosions. But not in Leeds. Instead, it was a fairly minor incident relative to the UK's problems, which then descended into a borderline apocalyptic state of affairs where buses were burnt, bricks were being thrown, anything was being thrown to abuse the police, who were somewhat attempting to take on the extremely horrific riot that was taking place. And it's very interesting to look at the general demographic of the ones that create such violence, and especially as we've seen in Tommy Robinson's protests, how the mainstream media like to slander them as far-right fascists and accuse them of all sorts of nasty things, when actually the BBC barely really covered the fact that Leeds was on fire. It's also equally interesting to read into what some of the rioters said. One guy turned around and said, "You know what I think about your government." Well, surely if you live in the UK, it's our government.
You know what I think about your government, about your social worker now? That's rude. Shame. Shame.
I think that's a really important nuance to pick up on. Language can give away a lot of truth. And clearly, this individual doesn't deem our government as his government. He deems it as not his government, even though he's living in the UK. Moving on, we have further civil unrest, but it gets even more dramatic. We see blatant machete fights in the streets of the South End, where the police literally are watching as there are men chasing each other with knives and machetes. We've had a police force so dedicated to policing online hate crime, so dedicated to putting LGBT flags on their cars, but they've clearly not put enough resources, time and money into stopping basic stabbings, but more importantly, public machete fights. This is Great Britain. We're supposed to be the building blocks of democracy, freedom, but somehow we're descending into something the majority of old Englishmen can't even recognise as England. It's no surprise that Tommy Robinson has gained so much traction. You don't have to be right-wing, far-right to observe that Tommy Robinson has clearly had a huge impact for a reason. Moving swiftly on, that was then extended into more protests regarding the murder of 3 girls by a 17-year-old young man. I think anybody, unless they are totally deranged, can agree that that is an absolute atrocity. But it's important to look at the cause, and it's important to try and mitigate rather than have Keir Starmer come out and talk about, oh, this is a problem and this should be solved. Well, yeah, what gave it away, but why was it happening in the first place? Well, it's the responsibility of not just your government, but the previous Conservative government to stop this kind of thing from happening. So isn't it bizarre that we have people coming out to protest against a murder of 3 young girls? But as we saw quite blatantly outside of 10 Downing Street yesterday, over 100 protesters were arrested.
I haven't done anything wrong. I literally haven't done anything wrong. Can you please speak to Officer Gemma? Look, Officer Gemma Willis there. Please, Gemma. Gemma.
Almost all of them were kettled and held against their will. We had people protesting against the murder of young girls, but their freedom to have anger, upset, and rebel against something that should never have happened in the first place was stripped away from them, and they were quite literally penned in like animals. The footage that we observed from Whitehall was horrific. Police officers literally pinning people to the floor. A one woman with a pacemaker who claimed she was just walking through was then arrested by police officers.
You just ran into me. You've just over. I've got a pacemaker. I've got a pacemaker. I've got a pacemaker. And they've just arrested me for walking up here.
When people were hitting the streets of London and saying, we don't support lockdown, we don't support vaccine passports, we don't support masks on children, the police operated in the exact same way. Which begs the question, is this a narrative that they want to enforce? Why are they so reluctant to stand with basic British people? Why is our Labour government so fragile when it comes to taking on the mass migration, both legal and illegal? And why are they so terrified to look at the basic correlation between migrants, stabbings, rape, and unlawful behaviour? It's not confusing. Statistically speaking, if you allow a load of unvetted individuals into a country, then a percentage of those individuals are going to behave in a way which isn't suited to our British culture, our British values. The fact it was a 17-year-old young kid that carried out these murders and attacks on 10 other individuals is evidence of how we are moving in the direction of a failing Britain. I can no longer say that I am honoured to be a member of this country. I'm not interested in the government. I'm not interested in what the monarchy stands for. I'm not interested in taking any side. I, and many others, are labelled as far-right extremists for believing some basic things. No, we don't want stabbing. No, we don't want our rights taken away. Yes, we do want the right to protest. No, we don't want loads of surveillance. No, we don't want mass migration. We are very concerned about our country, but British voices won't be heard. I said this 2 years ago, and I will reiterate it now Labour has come into power. The Labour government is the final step in the acceleration of Great Britain's demise. Through mass migration, through a completely corrupt police force, through basic tactics like divide and conquer, this country is going to move into a completely Orwellian environment. We saw with lockdowns the destruction of civil liberty. We saw choice taken away. We saw masks put on children. We saw a rolled out, which is now shown to be very harmful. We've seen a huge rise in excess deaths, none of which is reported on the mainstream media, and if it's spoken about so blatantly online, is censored, covered up, and shadow banned. We are now in the final demise of the West. It's not just England, it is the West as a whole. The founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, said, "You will own nothing and be happy by the year 2030. The United Nations invention of Agenda 2030 brings forward some very noble ideas, but how they are implemented and what the actual motivations of these ideas and concepts are is the worrying thing. And I believe Agenda 2030 is the final straw and the final destruction of the West as we know it. And we are seeing day by day, the UK especially, decaying with riots, stabbings, corrupt policing, surveillance, and a complete chaos, which British people are standing against, but are then being attacked by the control mechanism called the mainstream media. Continue to fight back against these very obvious attacks on England, and continue to fight for truth, because we're going to move into a direction where basic truth is going to become frowned upon, consistently attacked, and could put you in a position of direct vulnerability. But you have to make a decision. Do you opt for truth and take that risk? Or do you stay as a coward and watch your country fall around you? Thank you for watching this video. My name is Montgomery Toms. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter. Both links will be in the description. And please click the subscribe button.